I'm sure you hydrated yourself and you're ready for this new speaker. The first speaker talking now will be Jesus San Miguel from the CAMS, the Emergency Monitoring Service at the Joint Research Center. So Jesus did his university degree at the University of Madrid before moving to the US, where he completed a PhD. He now leads the development of the European Forest Fire Information System and the Global Wildfire Information System. He will be talking about climate change-driven emergency. Jesus, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Carlo. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah. So my talk, Carlo mentioned, is about the climate-driven emergencies, but I will focus mainly on forest fires. I'll give a short introduction of what the Copernicus Emergency Services are, the different components, and then I will move on to show some examples of the products that we already have available for the AMAP region. Please, next. Okay, so basically, Copernicus Emergency Management Services is composed of 3 components. On the left-hand side, there is an animation in this slide, but it doesn't really make a difference. On the left-hand side, you have a component that is called on-demand mapping that can be ordered by any user at any time for any place in the world. And it allows to monitor any kind of emergencies, natural or even human caused. Then there is a second component that is the early warning and monitoring, on which I'll be focusing today. And then on the right-hand side, you have a third component that is called exposure monitoring. And the monitoring of exposure is done by mapping human infrastructures at very high resolution, and considering that this is global, in the order of 10 to 20 meters. And this is a new component that just came into Copernicus in CAMS this year. So please, next. In the early warning and monitoring components, there are 3 topics we are dealing with. One is forest fires, second one is floods, and the third one is droughts. The droughts and floods component have a global information systems that are referred as a global alert information system and the global drought observatory. In the case of forest fire, the global component is still under development and is referred to as the global wildfire information system. This is a joint initiative of Copernicus, of the Group on Earth Observation, and also with a strong collaboration from NASA. In this system, what we do is we try to replicate the work that we've done in the European Forest Fire Information System in Europe. And we look at the fire cycle in the different phases. Before the fire events happen, looking at fire danger, then we monitor the events in real time, looking at active fire detection, burnt area maps. And once we have areas that have been burnt mapped, then we obtain byproducts such as the land cover damage, emissions assessment, potential soil erosion, closing the loop with the analysis of vegetation regeneration. Please, next. This is the first component I was referring to before. This is the analysis of fire danger in real time. We provide fire danger forecast at the global level. We are currently using 2 models, the ECMWF model, European Center for Medium Weather Range forecast, a deterministic model, and then the Meteo France model. And we provide fire danger, which is derived from meteorological conditions of precipitation in the days previous to fire events, the conditions of relative humidity, wind speed, temperature, etc. And as I said, the forecast is up to 10 days ahead of a given date. Please, next. In terms of active fire monitoring, what we use is for now 2 main sensors, the BIRS and MODIS sensors that are coming from NASA satellites, and we are incorporating the Sentinel-3 data coming from UNETSAT. This information currently provides information on elevation on Earth every 8 times every day. And now incorporating Sentinel-3, we will have 10 active fire detection services during the day, which allows us to not only monitor the fires in real time, but also to map the areas that are burned by these fires. Please, next. And this is just an example of the areas that were mapped in 2020 in northern latitudes, including the AMAP region. In the next slides, I will focus on specific products for AMAP. Please, next. This is an experimental service that is based on something that is very mature. That is the Fire Weather Index. It is a Canadian index that determines the conditions under which a fire will ignite and progress depending on the meteorological variables at the time of the fire. What you can see in this type of analysis is interesting because you can see that it is information coming from 1980 until 2021. In fact, 2022 is not in this graph, but it has been computed in the meantime during the last week. And 2022 is the year with the highest daily severity rating in all the range of time for which analysis are available. But you can see the 80s at the bottom, and you can see how the fire danger at the end of the year, these are cumulative graphs, keeps on increasing as we move to the current years. So the fire danger has been steadily increasing from the 80s, 90s, then 2010s, and now 2020s, which is a clear signal of climate change in these 40 years. Please, next. And as I said, we are then able to have customized products for AMAP. These are the graphs of burnt areas, monthly burnt areas and cumulative burnt areas for the last 4 years compared to the period 2015-2021. You see that there was a large peak during this year in June, but then the months of July and August have been favorable in northern latitudes, and the total burnt area now is below the critical years from 2019 until 2021. Please, next. And that is also reflected in the number of fires that are mapped in the region. Please, next. And the number of thermal anomalies, that is hotspots that are detected by the satellite sensors in the region. You can see the cumulative number of thermal anomalies in 2022 is below the lapse of variation between 2015 and 2021. So the second part of the core of the fire season has been favorable, and luckily this year we are having better results than previous years. Please, next. This is a graph of emissions, which is based on the methodology that is used in the Copernicus atmospheric monitoring service, which is based on the detection of fires from MODIS. So we know the detection from MODIS is fairly limited, and there is still progress to improve. We will be incorporating the BIRS sensor and potentially other sensors to complete the emissions. But this is a very useful service because it provides the emissions in real time. So we can have the monitoring of fire emissions on a daily basis in the AMAP region. Please, next. And just to finalize some of the examples that we have been producing at the JRC under request from the European Response Coordinating Center of our colleagues in DG ECO, the EC Civil Protection and Humanitarian Aid Office. This was the monitoring of fires and burnt areas between January and July 2020. Please, next. Similar analysis of emissions, an interesting analysis of the latitude of fires that were occurring in the middle graph. And you can see how the latitude has increased in the last years. So we are having fires in higher latitudes than the fires that occur in previous decades. And below the cumulative graphs of burnt areas. This was produced in 2021. And the final example, please, next. Is a very recent map of the analysis in the Arctic region between 2018 and 2022. Again, looking at the number of fires, the evolution during the months of the year, and the cumulative impact that these fires have in the AMAP region. Please, next. And with this, I finalize the presentation. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to reply to questions at the end of the session, I guess. Back to you, Carlo. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus, and thank you also for being absolutely spot on time. This is excellent. Thank you. So we heard of changes in the Arctic on the land surface, the fire, the permafrost, and the like. But actually, another important element often overlooked is what's happening up in the atmosphere. So our next speaker is Simon Chabrillin. He has been working on the atmospheric chemistry modeling in the middle atmosphere. He got his PhD at University Libre de Bruxelles, and he moved to the US to work there for a while, and then he came back at the Royal Belgian Institute for Space Aeronomy. He has been an important contributor to EU FP7 and Horizon 2020 project, and is still now working very in a significant role towards the Copernicus atmospheric monitoring service. So without further ado, I leave the floor to him to talk about the monitoring of the ozone hole over Antarctica. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Carlo, and hello, everyone. So I changed the title a little with respect to the agenda. It's more precise now. It's the monitoring of the polar ozone layer with the Copernicus atmospheric monitoring service. It's not only above the Antarctic, it's also sometimes above the Arctic that it's happening. Next slide, please. So I will recap very shortly what is the ozone hole. I will describe summarily the Copernicus service atmosphere monitoring service. Then I will present maybe the two most important products for ozone hole monitoring there. That's the CAMS reanalysis and the near real-time products to monitor extreme events from the point of view of polar ozone depletion, with two case studies for Arctic and Antarctic, both of them happening in 2020. And then the next steps which are happening in the CAMS system there. Next, please. So a short reminder about the ozone layer and the ozone hole. Next, please. So the ozone layer is in the lower stratosphere, that's between 10 and 30 kilometer altitude, and that's the region of the atmosphere where the ozone concentration is maximum, reaching around 10 parts per million. And it's very useful to absorb hard ultraviolet radiation from the sun, which would otherwise damage human health. So it's like this UV can cause skin cancer, eye cataracts, for example. And the ozone layer is depleted by chlorine and bromine compounds that are originally mostly human-made, emitted at the surface. So that's the ozone depleting substances, and the human-made ones were banned first by the Montreal Protocol in 1987 with some amendments afterwards. But we need to monitor this, first of all, because ozone depleting substances decrease very, very slowly. So most climate chemistry models project a return to the normal only around 2050 in the polar regions, as you can see on the lower right. And also there are some unexpected emissions of ozone depleting substances which occur. For example, there's a well-documented episode of CFC-11 emissions in northeastern China from 2014 to 2019. And lastly, but maybe most importantly, there are a number of feedbacks between ozone layer depletion and greenhouse gas-driven climate change. And those feedbacks are not really completely understood. The new feedbacks seem to appear now, especially in the polar region, so we need to monitor this closely. Next slide, please. So the ozone holes. That's what we call in everyday language an ozone hole is really a springtime depletion episode where the ozone layer is really attacked during spring above the poles. And it happens every year above the Antarctic. And it happens a few years, sometimes some years above the Arctic, in both cases in springtime. And it's caused by the isolation of air masses inside the wintertime polar vortex, so during polar night. So of course, the stratosphere then reaches extremely low temperature, so we have the formation of polar stratospheric clouds. Inside those clouds, we have heterogeneous chemistry on the surface of the particles of those PSCs. And this chemistry frees the chlorine, which is originally contained in the CFCs, in the ozone-depleting substances. Now, in springtime, that's when sunlight comes back, and it activates chlorine by freeing really the radicals, which then go on to deplete ozone in a catalytic manner. You can see an illustration for 3 different years, 2011, 2013, and 2020. On the left side, you can see how the ozone hole above the Antarctic is large and repeats every year. On the right side, there's actually the 2 recent years where it happened, 2011 and 2020, and a more typical year like 2013. Next slide, please. So now the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service, which is implemented by ECMWF. Next slide. That's an operational service. It provides information products about atmospheric composition, past, current, near future, with several focus. First of all, European air quality, then also emissions and surface fluxes of key pollutants and greenhouse gases, solar radiation, climate radiative forcing, and of course the ozone layer. Next slide, please. It's a user-oriented service which has an operational production chain with guaranteed continuity of service, which really sets it apart from the other kind of monitoring activities like we can do in national services, which have less guaranteed continuity of service, I would say. The data is fully open, it's free of charge. The documentation is continuously updated, and we have quality control as well, which is continuously updated too, and extensive help and support for users. Next slide, please. The information flow is extremely simplified here. It all starts, of course, with satellite data, but also in situ instrument for the quality control. And then this is ingested in the assimilation for the ECMWF global model, the integrated forecast system, which has been extended to atmospheric chemistry. So that's the one which is framed in red. And this provides boundary condition for a dozen of different European air quality model made by national services with a higher resolution. And those products, both from the global system and from the European air quality models, can then feed downstream services which are used by the CAMS users, for example, on smartphones, the windy service, and so on. Next slide, please. So the CAMS reanalysis starts in 2003 and extends to the present. Next slide. It's an important CAMS product. It assimilates many satellite observations. It's similarly to ERA5 that I heard mentioned earlier, but specifically for atmospheric composition. That's why it starts later than ERA5, because it requires, of course, satellite observation of atmospheric composition, which are sufficient in quantity and quality. So you see there's a multiplicity of satellite sensors there. The dataset characteristics, it's about nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, aerosol optical depth, and ozone, of course. It spans from the surface to around 80 kilometer altitude with a horizontal resolution of 80 kilometer. It has a 3-hourly time resolution, which is exceptionally fine for reanalysis, I would say. That covers now 20 years. And great care has been paid to time homogeneity, meaning the absence of spurious discontinuities or instrumental drifts. So this data set can then be used to compute climatologies, to study trends, to evaluate models, and to provide boundary conditions for regional models. Next slide, please. Now, the next question, of course, is how good is this reanalysis for ozone in the polar lower stratosphere? Here are validation results for the pressure layer 30 to 70 hectopascal. That's the polar lower stratosphere. On the left, you see above the Antarctic, and on the right, above the Arctic. It's the normalized mean bias with respect to satellite observations, which can be either assimilated, that's the green and also the red lines, or independent, that's the blue line. And you can see that we have a normalized bias smaller than 5%, so that's really a quite small bias we are considering, and no drifts and no discontinuities either in this product. So we trust its quality for polar ozone hole monitoring. Next slide, please. Now we are also monitoring in near real time for the, that's especially important when we have exceptional ozone holes. Next slide, please. There's a dedicated web page about this, about monitoring the ozone layer, where we can see the evolution of the current ozone hole with respect to the previous ones and the climatology. Here in red, you see the current ozone hole, which is developing in a rather typical fashion, I would say. The near real-time system, that's the same principle as the reanalysis that I explained previously, but it's updated twice per day. It includes forecast up to 5 days in advance with a resolution that is 4 times better than the reanalysis. The only downside with respect to the reanalysis is that discontinuities can and do happen since there are changes in the observing system and or in the CMWF model. You can also see on those monitoring plots on the left that 2020 was a very exceptional year, especially with respect to the duration of the ozone hole. And there are quite strong clues now that this comes actually from injection of wildfire, of aerosols, like organic aerosols coming from Australian wildfires, and that those fires were intense enough that the aerosols were injected into the lower stratosphere, then having a feedback with the ozone hole. So this also opens a new avenue for feedbacks between climate change and polar ozone depletion, if it is confirmed. Next slide, please. Now, ozone holes sometimes do happen also above the Arctic. This was the case 2 years ago, spring 2020. The wintertime polar vortex was exceptionally well centered on the pole, which is not the case usually above the Arctic due to geography. So the vortex was very stable, and as you can see here, validation above Ny-Ålesund with ozone zones. The quality of the reanalysis is excellent also from the vertical structure point of view. Next slide, please. There's a derived product that is the UV index. When you have meteorology and ozone depletion, of course, you can also derive the UV index, and that is available as well. Next slide, please. And finally, this is to say that the next upgrade of the global CAMS system will include the stratospheric chemistry module that will solve explicitly for stratospheric composition. This will make the reanalysis much more interesting for the stratosphere, as it will then include many more species that are directly related to ozone depletion. The forecast will then be much improved, and the system will be much more resilient with respect to the expected demise of a NASA satellite that contributes very strongly to an analysis of the ozone layer. So this concludes my presentation, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much. This brought us in the middle of the stratosphere, but we will go back to the surface with our next speaker, who is Chaglar Yumruk Tepe, who will be talking about the marine element, the Arctic phytoplankton, and understanding better the carbon cycle. So Chaglar is a physical oceanographer who has worked many years in developing biochemical models, both in the Mediterranean and in the Black Sea, and in the Arctic Ocean, is now working for as a modeler at the Nansen Center in Norway, where he's responsible for developing and applying biogeochemical compartment of the Arctic operational model, part of the Copernicus Marine Service. So without further ado, I leave the floor to you, Serdar. For yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the introduction. And you mentioned the Copernicus operational model, and today I will be showcasing this model, and we'll try to explain the basic dynamics of phytoplankton and their role for marine food chain and global carbon cycle. Next slide, please. So the phytoplankton, which are the majority of plants in the ocean, are microscopic in size and numerous in numbers, and they form the foundation of the marine ecosystems. And through photosynthesis, the phytoplankton fix energy in carbon compounds, which we call the primary production, and are responsible for half of the global annual uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which makes them on a par with plants on land. And some of this carbon is stored in the ocean and is removed from the atmosphere for the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. Because of these important roles, the accurate simulation of phytoplankton biomass is vital for understanding the higher level dynamics in the marine food chain. The direct relevance of this point for us is that the net primary production is closely related to the distribution and magnitude of marine fisheries catches. And through carbon uptake from the atmosphere, the phytoplankton are a vital component of the global carbon cycle with implications for climate change. Next slide, please. Here I try to visualize the seasonal dynamics of phytoplankton in the Arctic. Ocean is light limited, it's not just the Arctic. So if you take the average depth of the oceans as 4,000 meters, and if you scale it down to 40 centimeters, light is available only at the uppermost 1 centimeter in the ocean. So the rest is dark and production is not possible. And it is for this reason that the phytoplankton are microscopic in size, so they stay at the surface as long as possible. However, light is more limited in the Arctic because sun is not present throughout the year. And furthermore, the intense mixing in winter and spring contributes to this limitation, removing phytoplankton away from the surface. In fact, in early spring, for example, even though the light is limited at the surface, the phytoplankton are removed so deep in the ocean that they cannot sustain their productivity. It is only later in the spring that when the mixing weakens that they can sustain this production, which we call the spring bloom. Following the spring bloom, there are other limitations at play. One is that the ocean surface gets limited in nutrients because the nutrients were used up during the spring bloom. And two is that the phytoplankton are consumed by the predators. Finally, I should mention that the mixing is not always unwelcome. It is the mixing that provides nutrients to the surface. So therefore, understanding the balance between the light availability and mixing, which provides nutrients to the surface, is key to understanding the productivity in the Arctic. Next slide, please. In the following slides, I will be showing 2021 primary production, light, mixed layer depth, and sea ice extent from the Copernicus operational model. Let me explain the figure a bit. So the red light on the bottom bar indicates the timing of the year. So it's January 1st now. And the map on the left is primary production. And you see that production is quite low at this time of the year. Middle map is number of daylight hours. And the map on the right is mixed layer depth. So I kept the mixing at color at 200 meters. So when you see red, it means that it's deep mixing. And the sea ice thickness is indicated by 3 contour lines, red line showing the thinnest ice, which is the sea ice extent. So as I go through the slides, please pay attention to the production versus the light availability, mixed layer depth, and the sea ice extent. Next slide, please. So it's mid-March now, and the number of daylight hours has increased, so light is available at the surface. However, this is not reflected on the productivity, either because the mixing is quite deep or the sea ice is blocking the light. And in these conditions, production is not possible at this time of the year. Next slide, please. It's mid-April now, and light is further increasing at the surface, but still the production is still rather low. The mixing is still deep. But if you look in the south, especially the coastal areas and east of Iceland, because of weakening in the mixing, we see some starting of the production. Next slide. It's 1st of May now, and in the south there's a general weakening in mixing, and this is reflected on production that now is in the south is quite productive. Next slide. And later in the spring, it's 1st of June actually, and the conditions are just right for the phytoplankton, and a lot of light at the surface, mixing is quite weak, and we see a full-scale bloom throughout the region, except the areas where the areas of sea ice cover, and the light is blocked due to this ice, and production is quite low compared to the rest of the region. Next slide. And later in summer, the production is a bit weakening due to nutrient limitation and predator consumption. But if you look in the north, the ice has retreated a bit and more areas are exposed to light, and we see production there. It's not just at the very edge of the ice, but it's below the thin ice, the production is also possible. Next slide. It's fall now, the 1st of October. The production is weakened further. The light is receding, and even though the mixing is quite weak, the production is low because of the nutrients were consumed throughout the summer, and they need to be replenished with, in the next year. And production, high production for this year is over at this point. Next slide. So I want to recap things a bit. So in the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that the importance of phytoplankton as a food source for the marine food chain. And in my previous slides, I tried to showcase the importance of mixing and light availability for the phytoplankton productivity. Therefore, the changes in mixing and light availability will determine the productivity in the Arctic, important implications for marine ecosystems and society as well. Next slide. And in my final slide, I want to focus on these changes. There are large uncertainties in future projections of Arctic net primary production. Physical parameters, particularly light and mixed layer depth, should be well represented in our models in order to generate a good estimate of future primary production. The consensus is that so far there's the decline in ice cover over the recent decades has resulted in a pronounced increase in annual primary production in now ice-free Arctic waters. And the primary production is projected to increase due to sea ice retreat, increasing the light availability both in area and the length of the growing season. However, there is a large uncertainty among the models, primary production projections. You see on the figure that the spread around the average line is quite large. And this is due to variable mixed layer depth projections or rate of sea ice retreat or nutrient concentrations among the models. So far, the average shows that in the Arctic, primary production is going to increase. And as the models progress and improving their predictive capacity, we will be able to tell more about the future primary production in the Arctic and also the global as well. This concludes my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting. So we reached the last talk of this session. We still remain in the realm of biology, but we'll go for bigger creature than plankton, and in particular we'll be talking about the really large mammals. Our next speaker is Christophe Guinet. He is the director of the CEBC, Direction of Oceanology at Université Aix-Marseille 2, research director at CNRS. He will be talking about understanding the behavior of elephant seals at seas. The floor is yours.
Hello. Hello. So can we share my presentation? So I will be mostly talking about how southern elephant seal help us to observe the Southern Ocean. So if we can move to the next slide, please. And while doing so, we are also studying the foraging behavior of these animals. So during my talk, I will show you how these animals help us to observe the Southern Ocean, and all the data we gather help us to understand the foraging behavior of that species. Next slide. So what we should know, it's critical to observe the ocean has 93% of the excess of heat content of the Earth will be contained in the ocean. So if we, next slide, please. And to observe the ocean, we rely on a different system. Among them, the Argo float system is probably help us really to increase drastically the amount of temperature and salinity profiles in the global ocean. Nevertheless, there remain areas where we lack in situ data, among them the deep ocean, but also the coastal regions and the polar regions. And next slide. And this is a problem because if we look at the change in sea surface temperature over the last 4 decades, we can see that the highest increase of sea temperature took place first in the Arctic and secondly in the Antarctic, in areas where we are lacking in situ observations. So next slide. And it's what we can see here. With the Argo floats, we have an homogeneous coverage between 60 degrees south up to 60 degrees north. For the oceanographic vessels, most of the observations are taking place in the northern hemisphere, but we have really a lack of observation both in Antarctic and in the Arctic. Next slide. So really the idea was to equip a big seals, to collect this missing information. So, and why elephant seal is so, so helpful to collect that information. Next slide. So first of all, we can see here the track of southern elephant seals we equipped on Kerguelen. Those seals spent 10 months at sea, only 2 months on land. And when they are at sea, they covered up to 9,000 kilometers foraging. Not only they cover huge distances, but if we move to the next slide, they will do so by diving continuously and very deep. So here you got the dive record of a male elephant seal. So generally that seals was diving deeper than 500 meters and exceptionally up to 1,500 meters. And when I'm saying continuously, if we move to the next slide, you will see a 24-hour dive record of an elephant seal. So they will dive up to 2,000 meters, 20 minutes in average. So every day they will perform about 60 dives, separated by 3 minutes spent at the surface to breathe. Next slide, please. And so how do we equip them? So we need to capture them, anesthetize them, and to glue on their head a small computer which will provide us the position, the location, and also record some oceanographic parameters. Next slide. So to collect that information, we will rely on satellite data relay loggers, which transmit on real time some information about temperature, salinity, but also biochemistry parameters such as fluorescence, dissolved oxygen. And when the seal is back on land, we can recapture the seals, recover the tags, and recover high-resolution data sets, temperature, salinity, fluorescence, dissolved oxygens, but also light and acceleration. There are major constraints by equipping those animals about the size of the equipment, the limited energy supply, and also the fact that these data logger has to resist high pressure. So if we move to the next slide, this is just a a track of seals we equipped on Kerguelen going to Antarctica, and along the track you can see the change in temperature monitors by the seal. So the redder, the hotter, the bluer, the colder. So as the seal is going to Antarctica in summertime and coming back to Kerguelen in wintertime, you can see the change in the water column characteristics. So if we move on to the next slide, and if you recover the tags, you can get very high resolution data sets. So on the top, you got a 3-day record of temperature, and on the bottom of salinity during all the dives performed by the seals. If we move to the next slide, please. And this is a record of fluorescence to get some insight about phytoplankton concentration. This is a graph on the upper right of the seals going from Kerguelen to Antarctica, and you can see the change in chlorophyll A concentration along the track, along the change of density inferred from the temperature and salinity measurements. Next slide. So all these data are available to the oceanographic community through the Mercator and systems. And we started that program in 2004, and up to 2022, we equipped over 600 seals, and it is part of a long-term observatory in collaboration with Australia. And in red, you see the tracks of the females, and in blue, the tracks of males. So by tracking the two sexes, we cover different parts of the Southern Oceans. So if we move to the next slide. And so when you complete the previous graph where I show you the measurement obtained through the Argo float and the oceanographic vessels with marine mammals in blue, you can see that we are able to complete the existing in situ dataset of salinity and temperature profiles for high latitude regions, mostly in Antarctica, but starting in the Arctic, working with hooded seals and harp seals. And those data are made available through the Mail portal and integrated to the Copernicus marine system. And this system has been recognized as one of the network of GOOS, and the name of that network is Anibos, and you could find that on internet for more information. So if we move to the next slide. So currently, one of the big gaps we have in marine ecosystem is the measurement of intermediate trophic levels. And over the last few years, most of our efforts was to complete these measurements by a new range of tools. So if we move to the next slide, please. By measuring acceleration, we can detect pre-catch events when the seal is moving its head, and these black dots indicate every time the seal is trying to catch a prey. And these prey catches are overlaid with the temperature records obtained simultaneously by the oceanographic tags. If we move on to the next slide, and one of the latest development I wanted to talk about is about the inclusion of what we call a microsonar, or an active echo sounders. In a way, we are trying to replace the echolocation system of dolphins and to add that system on the head of an elephant seal. So if we move on to the next slide. So with this echo sounder, we can investigate the foraging behavior of the seal. So on the left, you can see the dive profile, so the depth according to time. You can see an echograms obtained from the echo sounder, so we can detect the target, which is getting closer to the animals. And on the bottom, an acceleration signals, a jerk, indicating a pre-catch event. From the microsonar, we can obtain some information about the size of the particles and their abundance. The color is indicating the abundance, and the size is at the bottom, and the acoustics levels vary according to the size of the particles. And on the bottom on the left, you can see a 24-hour records where you can detect a migration of zooplanktons being deeper during the day, going back to the surface at night and going down to deeper water layer during the day. So we now have a new tools to describe these intermediate trophic levels and then to complete what I will call the green component of the ocean. So if we move on to the next slide, I have finished my presentation, and if you have any question, I will be very happy to address them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. I think many of us, even in the chat, were expressing fascination for these fully sensed seals. So we are now at the Q&A session. First of all, I would like to remind all the people in the call, all the people who are following us, to use the Slido. There is the QR code in the video you can see now, and there are both Q&A questions, so questions for the audience, and polls on the top that you can fill and respond. So please use those tools because give us a feedback and so can allow us to have more meaningful discussion. So I would like to ask the panelist, the speaker of this last session, to switch on again their video so we can maybe take one or two very quick questions before having a quick interruption, and another coffee if you need, and then pass it to the next session. I only see myself, which may be what it is, but maybe the other are joining. Yeah, okay, I see some of them coming back online. My question, while waiting for the Slido to populate with a new question, my question was about these changes in the biomes and the ecosystem. We talked about the ocean. We talked about the forest fire. In your opinion, what is the biome? What is the ecosystem that is most likely to suffer within the next suffer the most within the next 10-15 years in the Arctic? And again, it's an open question to all of you.
Carlo, on my side, this is Jesus San Miguel. On my side, I think all the ecosystems.
You switch on your camera. Oh, yeah, you're on. Sorry.
I think it was on. Yeah, it was on. From my point of view, the ecosystems in the Arctic are just not used to forest fires. They don't have mechanism to recover after fires because those were rare events. So the increase of temperature and the increase in the frequency of forest fires will really damage all the ecosystems, and no one in particular. Probably the most dramatic change may be in the permafrost because of the increasing temperatures and then the temperatures when fires occur. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus. Any other taking for this question?
Yeah, I'm not really able to talk about the Arctic, but I would say for the Southern Ocean, I mean, one of the big change which will have huge consequences is the change in primary production. So we are talking about change in quantity, but I would like to stress that what might be even more important than the quantity is the change in the quality of the phytoplankton. So change in the composition of the phytoplankton communities. And we can address that question by in situ measurements, but also by using, the Sentinel products, by looking at reflectance anomalies, which is telling us something about changes taking place. And we can already tell that, for instance, the contribution of diatoms appear to be decreasing in the Southern Ocean. And this may have huge consequences on upper trophic levels.
Thank you. I think there was Shaglar.
Yeah, I was going to comment similar thing that any changes on the phytoplankton dynamics will ultimately affect everything on the higher food chain. So it's important. I would just kind of emphasize the importance of the changes on the phytoplankton.
Thank you. There is one comment that comes from the slide on is about air quality. So in a sense, I feel it can fall nicely into Simon's lab, and it's about the impact that in general air quality and maybe ozone in particular for the Arctic region may have for general population, not just biomes, but also human population there.
Yes, I'm not specialized in air quality myself. Actually, it's very possible that Mark asking the question would know better than myself how to reply this question. But I can at least say that a very important satellite sensor feeding CAMS at the moment is Tropomi. So that is Sentinel-5 precursor. And it does measure the amount of ozone and NO2, especially in the troposphere. This is an important contributor to the product. Of course, the global system covers completely the polar regions. And then I know also that the regional models for air quality go all the way up to Iceland and the tip of the Scandinavian peninsula. And that, yes, the validation reports do include in situ information for those regions specifically. So I would recommend to go look at those quality control reports, but air quality in the Arctic region is certainly part of CAMS.
Thank you, Simon. That was great, and in a sense, is a natural link with the next session that Attilio Gambardella will chair in a few minutes, and we'll really look at the Copernicus for the Arctic community. So linking is not just the change in the environment or the description of what's happening, but it's really the impact it is having on the community there. So I think we don't have much more time, unfortunately, but thank you very much. I ask, I mean, if we were in a real room, I will ask the room to join me in thanking you for your speeches. I think they will be clapping their hand in their office or at their own place. But thank you very much for your intervention. We have 10 minutes break for a coffee or whatever you fancy, and we'll rejoin with the next session at slightly later than 4:45 to 5. Thank you very much.